Hi, we continue in Genesis 22 today with Abraham poised with his hand over his son Isaac with a knife raised over him when the angel of Yahweh calls to him from heaven. So as we enter into this piece of our scene today, you can see on the right side of the screen, we're now in the second of the chiasms that we've been seeing in this section. And if you haven't watched the previous videos, I really encourage you to do so you can see where we are in the story. But both of these chiasms, as you can see, have a very parallel center about God will provide the lamb for the burnt offering. When we looked at it in the last video here, we recognized that based on what we saw up here, the text is ambiguous about whether Abraham is intended by God to either sacrifice Isaac, as most readers have assumed, or instead simply to bring him up to the mountain where they would together offer a sacrifice. As I said in the earlier video, that word is ambiguous and could have been read either way. So as we get to the point where we are here, we know for the first time that he has interpreted it as offer his son as sacrifice. And it's at the exact moment that the angel interrupts. And when we look at our scene here, we see there's a full chiasm here, repeating, as you can see, verbatim, the angel of Yahweh called to him from heaven, and we see here just adding a second time, and then you have not withheld your son, your only son, and we see that verbatim as well. But most scholars would agree that verses 15 and 18 are expressing a little bit of a different viewpoint and thus likely to be coming from a different source. I haven't been worrying about sources much in my whole series on Genesis, but I'm going to look at this one in a separate video because, as we'll see today, looking at verses 11 to 14, there's one interpretation that the angel offers of our entire scene that perhaps the second interpretation in verses 15 to 18 offers a different reading of it and leaves us with the one that most of us imagined all along was the only reading. So we'll just do 11 to 14 today, and we'll come back to verse 15 next time. So again, with a knife ready to be killed, the angel of Yahweh, and notice it's Yahweh now. We'd seen earlier that the one who commanded, or invited at least, we saw earlier, it wasn't really a command, although it was in the imperative form. It did have the Hebrew particle na, meaning please, as an option. And as we've seen, whatever we call it, an imperative or a command, was to take Isaac to the mountain, not to kill him. But obviously Abraham's interpreted it the way most readers do, and so some take it as it was Elohim who tested Abraham, but Yahweh who saved him. But there's really no basis for that other than in source theory, because Elohim and Yahweh are interchangeable throughout, and I don't see any scholars who see this part, 11 and 12, from Yahweh is from a different source than the first part. The story wouldn't make any sense if this was added by somebody else later. How else would the story have ended? But it is Yahweh here for the first time that we hear in the story. So the angel of Yahweh called to him from the heaven or from the sky. As the Midrash notes below, the angel called out in great urgency, like a man crying out in distress, "What are you doing? Do not lay your hand on the lad." And that highlights it. Already back in the Midrash in the early centuries of the Common Era, they were suspicious that God had not really intended Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, although other Midrash does celebrate him for his faith the way people have traditionally done. But we'll get back to that later. So he called him from heaven, or literally from the sky. We see that here in verse 15, and it also specifically recalls the parallel with Hagar, as we've been looking at these parallels, and many parallels here between the sending out of Hagar and Ishmael and the binding of Isaac here. There are also parallels with Hagar in chapter 16, but we've looked at those previously, and I won't bring those up now, but I'll mention it when we get a little further down. So with our keywords back up here, so called from the sky, Abraham, Abraham. And God's original call was singular Abraham. Now it's doubled, emphasizing the urgency, as we see in 46:2, but also the call of Moses in response to the cry of the Israelites in suffering, and the call to Samuel under the situation of Eli, who was corrupt and his sons were corrupt. Eli wasn't corrupt, but his sons were corrupt there. So in situations of urgency and transition, so Abraham, Abraham, and he said, "Here I am," responding identically to how Abraham responded to God. And we have to recognize that we know as readers this is the angel of Yahweh calling from the sky, but does Abraham know? Does Isaac know? Is Isaac having this experience? In the artistic images, whether it's Caravaggio's classic one or others, the angel is a visible presence in the classic Renaissance or other portrayals of angels, and so it suggests that Isaac could perceive the angel as well. But we simply don't know that. All of other Abraham's encounters with Elohim or Yahweh seem to be private, that Sarah wasn't in on it, and Hagar wasn't in on it, and so we have no reason to think that Ishmael's in on it here, which would leave it very mysterious. There's Isaac, I'm sorry, Isaac being not Ishmael here, that Isaac bound and with his father with a knife over his hand, and suddenly he stops for no apparent reason unless Isaac hears or sees the angel. So we just don't know that. So the voice says, do not lay your hand on the boy. And it's a triple negative here, as Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg notes, thus becomes the basis of blessing and affirmation in the second call of the angel. And that may be, but when we get to the second call of the angel next video, we'll look at that more closely. So do not lay your hand or reach out your hand, and notice the personal aspect of that. Don't kill him, but don't put your hand out on him. And notice what is said here, do not lay your hand on the boy or anything else, but where was the knife? The Midrash has that angelic tears fell and dissolved it, because we don't hear about it again. So and again, referred to as the boy here, not as your son, but as your son down here. So do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything. And why do we need this added? If he's not laying his hand on the boy, what else might he be doing? Some of the Midrash suggest he might have planned to strangle him if the knife hadn't worked, or if he'd lost the knife. But certainly the point is, don't do anything to your son. But now the response in relation to that is deeply ambiguous. So let's look at it closely. For now, I know, and as my note below from Westerman says, the phrase here, ata yadati, the original setting and meaning of that phrase is that of a cry of a person, joy of a person who's experienced the effects of God's action on his behalf. It is here transferred to the knowledge of God is gained, to the knowledge that God is gained through the testing of a pious man. And that may well be if this is taken as positively. But I'd like to suggest it doesn't have to be taken as positively, and it's not meant to be taken as positively. Let's keep going to understand that. So do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything, for now I know that you fear God. Is that the goal here? Was the goal of this that Yahweh or Elohim wanted Abraham and others to fear God? We've not seen fear of God at all before. We will see fear only in a couple of other places, and that's Jacob's fear of his brother Esau, and then Joseph's fear in 42:18. But there's not fear of God. Fear of God is a Deuteronomistic expression, and it's used in other places. But what the invitation was, love, or chesed, as we've been seeing throughout these chapters. Yet the relationship between God and these people should be one of chesed, that almost untranslatable Hebrew word that we've seen a number of times that can mean loyalty or mercy or kindness, or really the essence of God, who God is. And so as Abimelech called Abraham to provide chesed on Abimelech's son and grandson, as Abimelech claimed he'd provided chesed to Abraham, and as Lot experienced the chesed of God for not having him killed in Sodom, so the right answer would be that Abraham understands God as a God of chesed who would never call for the death of a beloved son. But what is revealed now is the opposite. That what God now knows is that Abraham fears God, is acting in fear of God rather than love of God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. The word for withheld here is repeated in verse 16, and it frames the scene here, and of course makes part of the chiastic parallel as well. Notice that was used earlier positively for God withholding Sarah from Abimelech, so that was a good thing. And here, in Potiphar's situation, where where Joseph says to Mrs. Potiphar that your husband Potiphar has not withheld anything from me except the kingdom and you. So we see it withheld in a couple of other places. But here, the fact that Abraham has not withheld his son is an indication of fear of God, and that's not the right answer. Notice that your son, your only son from me, is again repeating that, but leaving out the one whom you love. And that's the point here exactly, that Abraham is being seen here not as one of love, but as one generated by a fear of God that would lead him to kill his only son that he loves, that he knows of, because obviously Ishmael is still out there, but Abraham doesn't know it. The angel knows it, though. Is this the same angel that rescued Hagar and Ishmael in the first place when she was pregnant back in chapter 16, or even as we saw here with the angelic call here in chapter 21? It says the angel, not simply an angel. So if we imagine it's the same angel, or at least the expression of God's voice, then certainly that entity knows that Hagar and Ishmael are still alive. And yet Isaac is referred to as your only son. So in the face of that, we see this important scene with a twist that most scholars have not seen, but I want to draw our attention to here in verse 13. Notice that the scene is parallel to Hagar's looking up and seeing the well with her, which saves her child. So Abraham looked up, literally lifted his eyes and saw, parallel to verse 4 that we saw up here, when he lifted up his eyes and saw the place in a distance. And now what he sees is, with a henna that's not translated here, and he looked, and behold, a ram. The ram being the father to the lamb which Isaac had asked about in a certain way. And so, as my note below suggests, the lamb Isaac is preserved while the ram Abraham is offered to Yahweh. And yet, has Yahweh asked for the ram? What we're seeing here is perhaps that Abraham now understands he misinterpreted the original invitation, and now he's doing the right thing. He's brought Isaac up here, and now he's offering this ram as a sacrifice, although it doesn't say that Isaac is a part of it. And it doesn't say that Isaac's been unbound from the ropes with which he was bound. He's still lying there on top of the wood, as far as we know. But the ram was caught in a thicket by its horns. And as Middleton notes below, a ram caught like this would make a lot of noise trying to get out, so that if it was quiet, such that Abraham didn't notice it right away, it must have been stuck long enough to become exhausted, indicating it was God's plan for a substitute before Abraham looked behind and saw, or that Abraham simply wasn't looking when he was focused on what he thought his mission was, which was to offer Isaac in sacrifice. That's assuming that the ram is part of God's plan, but it doesn't say that here. It could just be there's a ram there, and that's what Abraham is choosing to do. But it's caught in a thicket by its horns. And there are many midrashic themes linking that to the shofar blast of the ram's horn. And the shofar will first be at Exodus 19:16, but we don't have to deal with that right now. And just to finish for a verse before we go a different direction, Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up using the same word that we heard earlier that he interpreted the other way as a burnt offering instead of his son, using the Hebrew word takath, which ordinary meaning is under, but it can mean instead, as here. And so we'll come back to verse 14 in a minute. But when we see the ram caught in the horns, caught in the thicket by its horns, that might bring to mind somebody else who was caught in a tree by their head, David's son Absalom. And that's what I want to focus on here. Because if the question is, does God want the sacrifice of sons? Earlier scholarship, which I mentioned in the introductory video, imagined the question as a second millennium question and asked about child sacrifice as a religious ritual among different peoples in the ancient world, that these characters might have been around or that the Israelites might have been around. But I want to suggest it's a much more immediate question. It's not the question of simply offering sons as sacrifice in the abstract. It's a question of what kings do. They take your sons and they put them in front of their chariots. In other words, it's monarchy that takes sons and kills them. Both internal monarchy, in this case we're looking at David and Absalom, but also external monarchy, the Babylonian monarchy or the Persian monarchy that was subject, the post-exilic people in the Persian province of Yehud were subject to. And that brings back a recollection of the question of, is this test a question of would he covenant with a king like Abimelech or would he covenant with God alone? So the test at one level is, does he interpret the question properly? Is it to bring Isaac up or is it to sacrifice him? But that question itself is presented because God isn't sure that Abram understands that making a covenant with a human king, even one who seems to act decently like Abimelech, takes away from his commitment to God alone, because kings will inevitably take your sons and put them in front of their chariots as part of war. And so I'd like to suggest that part of Genesis' larger anti-monarchy theme that we've seen all the way back to the Garden of Eden, when the original prohibition was eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which connects directly to Solomon's asking for the knowledge of good and evil in 1 Kings, and that Genesis is saying not to ask for that, that monarchy requires divine knowledge that no human has, that this story is continuing in that theme, a theme that we'll see all the way through the Joseph story till the very end. And so, as we look at this chart on the right side, we can see many parallels, not only between David and Absalom in our immediate scene, but between the whole David collapse story, the collapse of his family after the Bathsheba incident, which you've already noted is parallel to Abimelech, Sarah, and Abraham. Still with me, folks? Okay, so let's just look a little bit at this chart and see some of those parallels. So there's a question of a brother and half-sister incest, the question of Sarah and the question of Tamar here, and Tamar will come up again. The question of my son and the question of the son's death, as we saw in the previous scene. And we'll see 8 times where David says, Absalom, Absalom, my son Absalom. Being caught by the head in a tree leads to death, and those are 2 immediate scenes. The rare use of the phrase 1,000 pieces of silver, which Abimelech gave Abraham, is in 2 Samuel 18, where when one of the characters says, I wouldn't kill the king's son for 1,000 pieces of silver. It's only in Song of Songs elsewhere. And then in other parts of the story, in chapter 26 in Genesis, which we've seen already has many parallels with our immediate scene, and we'll get there when we get there, but where a character is spotted from a window in a sexually compromised position, where Abimelech looks out the window to see Isaac and Rebekah, and where Michal looks out and sees David and the servant girls. A condemnation for doing, quote, things that ought not to be done in almost exactly parallel situations in the Tamar and Amnon situation, in the Abimelech-Abraham situation. Parental tension over the half-brother and brother, the tension over Isaac and Ishmael, and the tension between Absalom and Amnon, echoing the tension between Cain and Abel, although those, of course, both full brothers. And the aftermath, alienation from family and community, where Abraham is no longer ever sees or talks to either Sarah or Isaac, and David is at least temporarily alienated from the army and all the tribes of Israel until his chief of staff Joab calls him back to business. And this is all based on the quote below from 1 Samuel 8, that is the way of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons. And so if we look at that in the larger monarchy story, we see a whole series of ways that not only royal sons, but mostly royal sons are killed. And that's a whole other aspect. Royal sons are often killed, as the sons of Saul are killed, out of political rivalry, not in battle, but also killed in battle. So Saul and his 3 sons are killed in battle, but then of the 3 sons of Zeruiah, Asahel is killed in a sense of rivalry. And I won't go through all of these, but we can see many, many examples, and these are just some of people being named as sons specifically being killed. That's not to mention all the ordinary members of the army. When David has killed his thousands, or Saul has killed his thousands, and David his tens of thousands, those thousands are all people's sons. Maybe not Israelite or Judahite sons, maybe those are Philistine sons, but still. So it's war and monarchy that demands sons, and especially monarchy, as the Israelite one does, as the Babylonian one did, and as the Persian one did, claim divine authority based on whichever gods they look to for divine authority. So I'd like to suggest that apart from the immediate question of Abraham and his choice around Isaac, Abraham, as many scholars have noted, representing Israel throughout this whole story, not just Israel as opposed to Judah, but Israel as the people of God who covenant with God in the wilderness, starting in the Exodus story. Representing them is asking that question: what choice do we make? Do we rely on God alone, who has mercy on us and does not demand the death of our sons in sacrifice? Or do we go to what I call the religion of empire, where we claim monarchy is God's will, and whatever the king wants is God's will, so if the king wants our sons, that's God's will. And so Abraham finally decides not to give his son only after the intervention here. So whether he's really gotten the message or not, maybe he's learned it now. It's not going to restore his relationship with Isaac, though. So let's just look at our last verse here before we end our video for today. So Abraham called the place. Notice there's an etymological note here, which is not often the case in a situation of such drama. Some scholars have seen that stories that set up a little etymological justification where the story is serving the justification, but plainly not here. And he calls it the Lord will provide, Yahweh Yireh, which has led some people to connect it, as the Midrash does, with the Yireh Salam, Jerusalem, he will see peace. But the provide in the English here connects what we don't often hear in provide, which is that the word from the Latin provideo means to see forward. And literally what we're having, what the Hebrew has here, is the Lord will see to it. So provision means God is providing. And notice it's related also to the English word providence from that same idea. So Yahweh will see to it, as it is said to this day, the day of the authors, whenever that is, on the mount of Yahweh it shall be provided. And that's one of those things that links it with Mount Moriah in 2 Chronicles, as we've seen before. So if we ended the chapter or the scene here, the lesson of the story would be: reject monarchy that takes your sons, and Abraham has done the right thing of offering a ram and sacrifice, and would be preserved with his family as God intends. But the angel of Yahweh calls a second time, and we'll have to look in the next video about whether that gives a different nuance to whether what Abraham does has divine approval or not. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.